Is the reason we can't have nice things because of capitalism? Does the Colorado and Maine decision to remove Trump from the ballot mean we now live in a banana republic? And how should we evaluate economists who get things wrong? Join me and Donny as we answer these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather posts that we see on our social media feeds from Twitter and Facebook and all over, and we go through them, try and pick them apart, pick out what's good, what's bad, and make our own arguments for what we think is right. My name is Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donny. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe. You can find us on Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into our first take. So our first one is a comment on a post by Rand Paul. Rand Paul posts an article with a picture of Julian Assange, and he writes, "Proud to join Representative Thomas Massie and a bipartisan coalition urging the President of the U.S. to drop the prosecution of Julian Assange. The U.S. shouldn't pursue an unnecessary prosecution that risks criminalizing journalism and chilling freedom of the press." And then Can Deegan replies, "First time I ever disagreed with you. Assange meant to hurt the U.S. He didn't release secret docs in a responsible way like Snowden did." What do you think? Is Assange on the hook and is Snowden off the hook?
This was truly one of the more baffling takes I've seen. Not because I'm baffled that anyone would hate on Assange. There's plenty of people who don't like Assange, and I disagree with them, but that makes sense. There's plenty of people who don't like Snowden, and that makes sense. I've never seen someone dislike Assange who liked Snowden. Usually the argument goes that Assange was merely the journalist. He was reporting stuff that was given to him that was being curated in some way, shape, and form. WikiLeaks, I believe, was releasing things somewhat incrementally versus Snowden, who actually did a much bigger dump. And Snowden had, the argument would be Snowden had a contractual obligation to keep these secrets. So, whether or not he was whistleblowing, he may have, violated some. The Snowden case is less clear in many cases from a lot of perspectives than the Assange one. The Assange one generally is he was provided information about the activity that was being done that was harmful, and he, as a journalist, was reporting on it. Now, of course, I think both of them are justified, right? Because I don't think you need to follow some kind of framework of the established power that's trying to cover its own butt, right? Like, it's like, oh, well, if you can't report on us doing bad things if you've contractually obligated yourself to not. It's like, well, okay, but if you see something wrong, you probably ought to highlight the fact that, hey, that the U.S. government is actually spying on all the citizens behind your back, whether or not you signed a document saying you wouldn't. You probably have a bigger moral obligation when you see that kind of thing going on. But yeah, so this is just a very confusing take, because I think this guy might be getting confused a little bit, just in the sense that he might be thinking Assange was the one who didn't curate, like Snowden didn't really curate that much. And yeah, WikiLeaks did unveil a lot of information. That's true, and a lot of it makes the U.S. look bad. But that's kind of the point: is that you need to see behind the curtain, and you need to see the things that the government doesn't want you to see. That's kind of the whole point of the alleged representative democracy, is that the government's supposed to be accountable to the people. And so those kinds of things ought to be known, because, they're supposed to work for us.
Yeah. What's funny about the take to me is, like, well, yes, Assange exposed all of this corruption and legitimate evil being perpetrated by bad people in the United States military, overseas, as well as just other corrupt stuff going on within the government to prolong the wars and do awful things to prisoners and all this stuff. But because he meant to hurt the United States, now that's all void for some reason. And it's like, it doesn't, for the general populace, or I don't know, it doesn't matter whether or not he meant to hurt the United States, as long as everything that he says is true in a lot of ways. Like, is he exposing a crime or is he not exposing a crime? And even the people that don't like Assange admit that he was exposing crimes and wrongdoing. So, in any scenario, there can be someone that has the intention to hurt someone else, and they're still within their rights to do what they're going to do in matters of self-defense. I mean, you could argue that a prosecuting attorney is trying to hurt Julian Assange, right, by throwing him in a cage and all the other awful things that they've done to him overseas and in other countries at the behest of the United States government. Anytime you are going to say someone has done something wrong and they should be held accountable for it, yes, things are going to be painful, and you could leverage and say, yeah, they're trying to hurt them. And in my opinion, if something withers in the light of truth, it probably deserves to wither in the light of truth. The other aspect of it too is like this, let's just give the benefit of the doubt, regardless and set aside the Assangement that hurt to the US argument. There's this other aspect, and regardless of whether he's getting Snowden and Assange mixed up, there's this thought of like the good leaker. That like certain types of leakers are good because they protected certain U.S. intelligence assets and they didn't put certain types of interest of the United States at risk. But what's funny is that all of these leakers, and one of my favorites, as I was kind of reading up on some of this in preparation for the show, I was reminded of like Daniel Ellsberg released a ton of stuff on Vietnam and corruption, and at the time, like people thought of him awful, like he was an awful, bad human being. And since then, as public perception of the Vietnam War and everything that occurred in the Pentagon Papers have kind of come out and been validated as true, people now refer to Daniel Ellsberg as like, oh, a good leaker. And you'll see a lot of people talk about him when they're talking about Assange or Snowden. It's like, oh yeah, he's a good leaker, but Snowden and Assange are bad leakers. But it's like all the things that people accused Ellsberg of doing and being bad about back in the 70s and 80s, it's also true of Snowden and Assange, and they conveniently forget that he did sometimes dump things that would put certain types of assets at risk. But I think we'd all agree that everyone is better off knowing that we were prolonging a war that was killing millions of people overseas and hundreds of thousands of our own people here back at home. So it's overall better for these things to come to light if there's evil and corruption going on, and whether or not their intention is to hurt the United States or whether or not they do that in a more or less responsible way doesn't really matter, because they wouldn't do that, and it wouldn't be irresponsible if the people that were perpetuating this corruption and evil hadn't done so in the first place.
Yeah, it makes me think about the almost short-sightedness of a lot of people when they only want to look at the immediate harms created by an individual action and not looking at the preceding actions that sort of cascade. So, if let's say you have a leaker and they leak something in an irresponsible way, right, where there's lots of collateral, lots of damage done, there, depending on the case, in a case-by-case scenario, there are justified ways to say, hey, this person, I don't know, leaked this in a way that was harmful, right? For example, let's say, okay, John Bolton is trying to get us into war, and here's his home address. Like, I wouldn't say that you should leak that home address, because that's not actually going to do anything right. But if you have that together, you should condemn. Yeah, don't dock someone's home address. I do think that would be wrong. But also, like, let's also look at the prior events. Like, let's not just let John Bolton off the hook because because a wrong was done to him. You also have to look and say, hey, the things that this guy found out, John Bolton, like lying us into wanting to bomb a foreign, this is hypothetical, of course, but lying to get us involved in another foreign entanglement, like that should also be condemned, and rightly so. And so, yeah, it's one of those things where, I can't remember the name of the guy with the Discord leaks that happened somewhat recently.
Jack Teixeira.
Yeah. Jack, that was probably not the most curated and responsible leak that ever happened. And so you could argue, oh, there was a lot more thing that put soldiers at risk. So you could condemn those, the way he leaked that. But don't let that, don't make it like this is a courtroom where it's like, oh, the evidence was acquired illegally, therefore we can't use any of it in court. It's not permissible. It's like the things that he, revealed about the Ukraine war and the fighting, losing, that's all very real. And whether you want to bury your head in the sand or not, it exists, and it's better to acknowledge that, to condemn the actions that prolong us in this war, to take it into account, to make your current calculations, and the world's not black and white. It's not like, oh, this guy did something a little bit off, therefore we can't use anything from it. It's like you need to see the world as it is, not as we often wish it would be. And so if people leak things in a bad way, that's unfortunate, but let's still take a look at the leaked information and calculate using that in a real manner. And so I think, even if you are arguing that Assange meant to hurt us, I think you're right in that. Okay, well, even if he meant to, the outcome needs to, you need to change your outcomes based on the information that's being provided, and you should condemn the US doing these bad things in the first place.
Yeah, I have a friend who used to work for one of the intelligence agencies, and I remember talking with him many times about Snowden, and it was always really interesting to me because he would be like, yeah, like the Patriot Act and all these surveillance things that Snowden revealed, they're wrong, and the people that are implementing them and were doing so behind the Americans' back should be prosecuted. But Snowden signed a contract and he had a duty, and there's just certain rules when you're in the intelligence agency you shouldn't violate. And I was like, man, like, so you're basically saying your principle and loyalty to the intelligence agency and this, whatever type of, country club that you're basically in is more important than the principle of freedom and supporting and honoring the people that literally pay your salary and that you swore that you were going to protect. And I think it just reveals that, like, even if Assange and Snowden and all of these guys like did it, and Jack Teixeira, like we're talking about, like don't have good motivations, and they are maybe not even heroes because they are, didn't have altruistic or awesome motivations. I think in the case of Snowden and Assange, they did. It's still something that should be prosecuted from the American people's side to be like, hey, government, we fund you, we pay you. Isn't this supposed to be our, by the people for the people? You and I don't necessarily believe in that, but if that's what it's supposed to be and that's what you're telling us it is, then shouldn't you also be held accountable for going behind our backs and doing all these different things? And I think that my friend's mindset just reveals the like elitism that these people who are, quote, public servants actually have towards the general populace. They believe that they are supposed to go do and make the hard decisions that we can't. But that's not what we hired them to do. That's not the purpose of them. They are supposed to serve us. And what's ironic about it is that the people who are making the hard decisions unilaterally without having to check in with anyone that are actually paying prices for people are the people like Snowden and Assange that are, now on the run in foreign countries or in jail in a foreign country trying to be extradited to the United States. So those are the actual, whether or not they personally had heroic motivations, they are heroes in the actual implementation of the information that they've leaked and what they put forward.
Yeah, I completely agree.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Noam Blum, and he writes on the Claudine Gay Senate hearings. Harvard thought they were pulling a power move, getting behind Claudine Gay, and now they're reduced to inventing neologisms.
I think it's neologisms.
Neologisms like duplicative language to excuse her plagiarism. It's honestly beautiful to watch. What do you think?
I think it's a good take. I think he's right in that it's not. I wouldn't say this is like the most illuminating take, right? I think we're aware that not only is this happening, but has been happening for a long time. But it is pretty interesting, I think, to see the amount of pressure that is being put on the institutions like never before. And so they're saying things that are more and more ridiculous. So, to someone like you or I, a lot of the terms that are sort of circulating in the vernacular of, again, popular culture or in the most extreme cases, woke ideology, they are kind of ridiculous, right? For instance, the idea of birthing person, or even something as nonchalant as pronouns it's ridiculous on its face, but it's been put into the culture kind of in this, I wouldn't say totally sneaky, but somewhat sneaky way, that a lot of people accept it. But now we're getting to the point where it's not, they don't even have to make these terms for very broad ideas. They're making them for very specific niche use cases, which is what makes this so funny, is they realize that in order to try to it's like they can't admit to anything going wrong for anyone in this in their intersectional checkbox of she fits these particular identity columns. We can't admit that she's a bad egg, or else we lose all credibility. So now we're going to lose all credibility by making a
Yeah.
niche term called duplicative language to try to exclude plagiarism, which is just really, really funny, kind of sad. And I hope that it awakens a lot of people to see they will make these terms not only for, again, broad movements that you might think are somewhat justified, but hopefully that leads you to see, oh, it's not a matter of just them, trying to coin new terms as we're a developing society. They are making these terms just to cover themselves. There's literally no benefit to it, other than protecting their own.
Exactly, and it's the most blatant and latest, I guess, example of a team mindset principle. It's purely, I have this team, or I have this person that serves my power interest to wield power over you, and anything we can do to make sure that they are okay and that they advance our agenda, we're going to do. And it's not based in anything that is outside of self-interest, which is, you and I've known about that for a long time. What's beautiful about this is that I think a lot of the normies are seeing it, and they're like, duplicative language, like what? So now plagiarism is totally fine. You could talk about, like, it reminded me of when who's that governor? Andrew Cuomo, the Andrew brother, would kind of excuse his, Me Too movement as, well, I'm just Italian, man. Like, this is just what we do. It's like, okay, like, okay. So not only are you like excusing bad behavior and humiliating behavior towards women, the people that, we should be protecting, but you're also going to throw like all other Italians with a stereotype that they also treat women in a humiliating and degrading behavior and manner. So it's just like they will shift every which way. And one of the things that I hope kind of comes about from this, and I don't think that it will necessarily, like, I have many friends who are self-described moderates, and they will say things like, well, at least people just need to start talking, like there's just misunderstanding on one side and misunderstanding on the other. And if everyone just talked, everyone has good faith. Like, we need to just come together and we can figure it all out. Like, moderate, look at this and realize that they don't actually want to figure anything out with you. They just want to hold power over you. And they will literally invent new types of language and new terms, a new type of logic to continue to hold that power over you. They are not interested in talking. They're not interested in reasoning. They're not interested in any sort of compromise. They're only interested in holding that power and destroying you. There is no conversation here, because if you could reason with these people, well, I mean, it's indicative. Like, neologism, I believe, is like, it's a new type of logic, is what that means. It's like, yeah, they are literally reinventing reality to suit their purposes. There's no reality that you can have a conversation with this person and agree on anything unless it is their own point of view and what they want to implement over you.
Yeah, exactly. These desperation for power is coming even to the language itself, which we've known, right? And I think that that's something that people underestimate the overall importance of, but like, the power of language is huge, and it matters. And so seeing the sort of desperate pleas that we get over, or the desperate plays, excuse me, that we see in these ways, are revealing that they're trying to weaponize language. And I think, I don't know, to me, my guess would be that, the way that you make neologisms work is not in a desperate play that is instantly thrown. I think it's usually one of those things that slowly picks up over time. And so the fact that they're throwing it out and trying to get it quickly adopted really does maybe show the fact that they see that words and language has power to shape the culture, the kinds of conversations that you have, the framing, the worldview. But they don't have the time to build it up yet in this particular case. So hopefully, again, that this will elevate people to the point, like, oh yeah, they're just desperate for any ounce of power. They will do anything for it. They will invent ridiculous terms on their face, and hopefully people see how Orwellian that really is, in the sense that they're telling you, we've always been at war with
Eurasia.
I don't. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's what it seems like to me. It's like, oh no, we've always been okay with duplicative language. It's like, I don't think so.
But plagiarism, no, that's a no.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, plagiarism is when you do it. Duplicative language is when I do it.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Moving on to our next one. We've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he writes, the Colorado Supreme Court ruling makes America look like a banana republic. Why doesn't every American understand that if they do this to a former U.S. president, everyone is vulnerable to punishment for crimes with which they have never been convicted? Democracy would be in total shambles. What do you think?
I think that this is overall a great take in that he recognizes the absurdity of the situation we find ourselves in with President Trump being removed from the primary ballot in Colorado, as well now as in Maine, I believe.
Yes, I think it's been overturned in Colorado. Right?
Has it already? I haven't seen that, but I know. Well, I don't know that it has, because it was the Supreme Court, or the state Supreme Court. So I think this is going to be, this was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, because I think they're going to have to rule on it. I don't know that there's any other method for which they can overturn. But yeah, it's pretty crazy to find ourselves at. So I've not been super impressed with RFK Jr. since the whole Hamas Israel thing. But I at least recognize that he's making a good stand here. Democracy would be a total shambles. Again, kind of funny in that, this is kind of the natural result of democracy in some
if
ways.
Everyone in Colorado voted for him to be off, then he should be off.
Right, which of course this isn't what happened, but it's right, exactly, in that democracy isn't the good measuring stick here, but it is really an affront to democracy, right? Because the democratic solution to this would be let people vote, and if they all think he had an insurrection, then he wouldn't get elected to begin with. So he's correct in that it is sort of democracy in shambles. I just think it's funny because democracy in shambles would be just saying, okay, did he commit an insurrection? Let everyone vote on that. Which again, that's kind of a silly way to define things. But I mean, he's correct in that if this is happening to a former U.S. president, everyone is vulnerable, and that is I think a good standard to set, because I think a lot of the times people think, oh well, a president shouldn't be above the law, and they hold it like this lofty. We let presidents be above the law all the time. Almost every single president of our lifetime, or in history, really, has been above the law in some way, shape, or form. The fact that they're held accountable is a joke and a myth.
Yeah. So
the fact is, if they are hunting down a president, they probably can hunt, or not. They probably can. They absolutely can hunt down every single individual. As you're seeing with like the January 6th stuff, frankly, seeing people who are on the premise did nothing wrong getting thrown into prison. If they're punitive with Trump, they can be punitive with everybody. And so this hopefully puts that on display on a bigger stage for a lot of people. And I hope this is rightly condemned by a lot more people. And so good on RFK Jr.
Yeah, this is overall a good take. And Bobby Kennedy's been pretty good on Trump and like the fair treatment of him for a long time. I think people that are coming around to this just now, after it got to, we literally took him off the ballot, like, you're a bit late. It's been this way since 2016. There has been an establishment and a deep state that has been obviously against Donald Trump. And people say, well, you can't really define the deep state. It's like, yeah, I can. It's all of the intelligence agencies and alphabet agencies and all of the bureaucrats that are unelected in Washington that don't like him. We literally have text message and email and phone correspondence that shows that they wanted and conspired to make sure that he, one, tried to not get him elected in 2016, and then once he was elected, make sure that he wasn't able to be effective, and then when he went up for re-election in 2020, conspired to make it as difficult, and ultimately succeeded in keeping him from getting re-election.
Well, and if you don't believe Britt, you can read the super fringe right wing publication, the New York Times, for that headline about the conspiracy to keep Trump off the ballot, or from winning re-election.
Was it the conspiracy or the cabal, or I can't remember what it was. It was not a good term, and they were proud of it. They were proud of it. It was like, oh, the Avengers assembled to take down the big bad Donald Trump, and that's kind of how they put it. But it's like, no, I think you should realize that, like, there are at least 70 million Americans that are like kind of pissed that you did this. And that's a lot of people. But yeah, a lot of folks now are coming around to it, but it's the hour is late to come around to the fact that there is an entire apparatus of unelected officials and people who are elites trying to make it so that Donald Trump can't get back into office and don't like him. And like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is saying, democracy in theory has to only works if you can platform ideas and let them argue their merits, and then let the people decide. And so in that aspect, like, there should not be any, top down Supreme Court or some I think it was like the Republican Party in Colorado also was like in support of this. I can't remember quite exactly, but basically a few people decided what should or should not be on the ballot for the primary. And it's like, no, like, just if you're so scared of these ideas, or if you're not scared of those ideas and he's wrong, then at least let him get up on the platform and make a fool of himself. If he actually committed a crime, then you should go arrest him, right? Like, a call to violence is an actual crime that can be proven and litigated in a way and be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And it is something that you, in our legal system, you can be arrested for. But these people know they can't prove that. There is no, that is an actual legal theory. It's not a novel legal theory where they believe they can, like, whatever this, I can't remember the terms they used in New York and all these things, but like, these are novel legal theories that have no way of being actually proven. They're totally new. They have no precedent for them. And those are the ones they charge them with. But the ones that are ironclad that can actually be litigated are the ones that they avoid. Because if they actually went after him on these types of charges, they would quickly lose, because you can't win that argument. You can't actually prove that he did a call to violence and is guilty of that. All these other weird ones that they've invented. And it's very similar to the Claudine Gay thing. Not only do they invent language, but they will also invent new legal theories and new legal challenges and new reasons to keep people off of the ballot. They are not, not only the Democrats, also the Republicans. They are not a party of principle. They do not have actual undergirding reasons or morals that guide them. The only thing that guides them is power and the outrage that someone like Donald Trump was able to occupy the highest seat of power in the United States, and they weren't.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I don't think I have any more, but
cool.
Yeah.
Me neither.
Yeah.
All right. Our next one. So we blurred out who wrote this column. It's an opinion piece, and the title is "Beware Economists Who Won't Admit They Were Wrong." And the date of this is December 18th, 2023. And the person, if you're watching on YouTube, we're going to reveal it right now who wrote this. And it is Paul Krugman, the one and only. What do you think about this title, and mainly about who wrote it?
I mean, the funny thing is, the take itself is not the worst take I've heard.
No.
As a rule, you should listen to someone, and if there is clear empirical data that suggests that they're wrong, you should listen. And if they won't admit it, you should be skeptical. I would take a look at basically everyone in the COVID regime, right? Anthony Fauci, all these people who are telling you, oh man, with it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated, or these masks are going to prevent the spread, or what. There has never been one apology. There's never been anything. So you should probably beware of that, right? But when Paul Krugman's writing about beware economists who won't admit they're wrong, you have to understand, like, the sentiment itself might be correct, but Paul Krugman is the funniest person in the world to say that, because he has been wrong so many times and will barely admit he's wrong. And when he admits it's wrong, it's on something that's so irrefutable and he'll dismiss it. So, for instance, if you're going back to something like his take on the internet, then he'll admit he was wrong on something like that, because it's so far in the past. Like, well, yeah, I mean, it was hard to say, and he'll dismiss it, downplay it any number of ways that he possibly can. But when it comes to actual things of substance, like, for instance, just in general, his economic framework, he'll never admit he's wrong, and he'll justify why he's right. So it's just very, very interesting and funny. And he would probably, I need to actually open the whole thing. I've only seen the headline, but my guess, if I had to take a guess about what he's talking about here, my guess is he is talking specifically about the
Bidenomics.
inflation. Yeah, exactly. Bidenomics and the inflation rates. And what they'll do is they say, oh, everyone thought inflation was going to keep going up and up and up, but it went down from 7 or 8% to 2%. Now, again, never mind the fact that this is after a whole series of these same people saying there won't be inflation. Well, there might be a little bit, but you're just imagining it. Here's why inflation's a good thing, right? They wouldn't admit they were wrong. And now that it looks like numbers are on their side, they're, oh, wow, you need to be wary of people who won't admit they're wrong. Of course, they're not explaining to you things like 2% inflation doesn't mean we're down to 2%. That means we're at 2% from the 8% on, stacking already. So it's a completely bogus way of processing the data. And it's a completely bogus way of trying to portray that, oh, look, inflation's going down. Like, the rate of inflation is going down, but the actual value of your dollar compared to goods and services is not going down. It's not suddenly a lot more affordable to buy things than it was last time. It's still just as hard. And in fact, 2 point whatever percent harder than it was last time. It's not like all of a sudden, just because we're in a new year, that means that everything has shifted forward for your own raises, your own dollars. The dollars don't magically get back the value from last year's inflation. So when he's talking about beware economists who won't admit they're wrong, he's presenting the data in just an absolutely bafflingly stupid way, and he's not allowing room for people to actually explain those facts. So, for instance, if my prediction was we're going to see an increase in inflation, he's coming back and saying, oh, it was 7%, now it's 2%. That's a decrease. You're wrong. And then if I try to explain myself, oh, look, he won't admit he's wrong. Well, I'm not wrong in that scenario. You're just misrepresenting the facts to suit your narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. This title is like, let's just say there's a title that says, don't trust political leaders who can't keep it in their pants with anyone other than their wife, written by Bill Clinton. And it's like, okay, that is, you're correct, right? Like, that title is correct and is true. But what leads me to believe that the arguments being made in this article are not going to be true is based on who it's written by, because they obviously very purely do not live out that mantra or that principle in their own life. And yeah, you're totally right. In this article, he's trying to do a little bit of a victory lap about inflation being transitory, because that's what he was always talking about. It's like, oh no, inflation's transitory. There's not a problem with the entire monetary system with a central bank controlling interest rates up and down. That's just a mechanism that we need to have to actually stabilize the markets. It's helpful for us to have that. His entire axiom of his economic worldview and principle is based on central planning. It's not based on free markets or anything. He's anti all of that stuff. And so any worldview that he puts out there, or any interpretation of the data in the past, has to be run through that. And so what central planners and what Keynesians do all the time is they shift the window of what they want to look at. And this is kind of the tricky part. They shift the window and the timeline of when they're looking at whether things are good or bad, illustrated by your concept of like, oh, well, inflation went down from 7% to 2%. And it's like, okay, well, 2% of inflation last year is like 50% of what inflation was going to be back in the 1980s or the 70s. Yeah. So it's still very, very bad if you look at it on a really large scale. If you to illustrate this in like a common analogy, like what Krugman is basically saying is, you've got an injury on your arm and you're bleeding out a liter of blood every hour. That's the equivalent of the flow of blood out of your arm. And then someone comes along and they throw a tourniquet on it, and now you're bleeding like a cup of water or a cup of blood every hour. And it's like, hey, we've stopped the bleeding. It's like, no, you haven't, man. Like, you've only reduced how much is coming out, but it has not actually reduced the inevitable consequence of stopping the bleeding, which is you're going to die. And inflation, and every single American, every single person around the country, they're not too stupid or too misinformed to understand that life is harder today than it was a few years ago. That you have to work more hours harder to earn more currency to buy less. Like, that's the practical application of what happens when inflation is going out and we have expansion of the money supply. And so Krugman's for him to properly interpret the past, if you want to have like a unified theory of economics or a unified theory of what has occurred in the past 7 years and be able to explain it to someone, you can't look at it and with the view that we need to have central banks because, or sorry, can't look at it that the central banks didn't play a role in the inflation. Krugman wants to believe and wants you to believe that it is they've only ever helped. That if they get it wrong, that's not the cause for any of this inflation. That making money easy, making more money out there, printing it, and then not only that, but also like shutting down the world for 3 years. So we made less stuff and we printed more money than we've ever printed before. That has no effect on it because in order for you to grapple with the past 7 years, you'd have to admit that might have had some bearing on what we're experiencing today. And if you admit that it has some bearing on what we're experiencing today, then his entire worldview, his entire axiom for his economic basis is totally destroyed. And everything that he has said ever can now be considered wrong or a lucky guess. And that's the problem and the cost of being wrong for so long. And so, yes, Paul Krugman, you need to beware of economists who won't admit they're wrong, because if they are wrong for years and years and years and years, they will never get it right, and you can never trust what they say.
Exactly right. I think you nailed it.
All right. You want to move on?
I think so.
All right, let's move on to our last one.
You can only kick him so much when he's already down.
I mean, dude, there's literally they don't make episodes anymore, but there's literally an episode called podcast called Contra Krugman by Tom Woods and Bob Murphy.
Yeah.
Where they literally just expose how every week something that he wrote in the New York Times or anywhere else is totally wrong. And they pick him apart really good. You could he's so wrong all the time that you could make a podcast about it and generate content for years. Just doing the opposite of what he did.
Oh,
instead.
It was such a good podcast.
Isn't it funny that, like, I know we've already beat the dead horse, but this article he wrote, we were viewing it on the internet, the thing that would be, obsolete, made obsolete by fax machines.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just it's delicious.
Yeah,
I love that that was anyone. To be fair, right? Like anyone could make that like mistake in their their forecast, but like it's just delicious that he made it. And
oh yeah. Well, it's one of those things where making these kinds of mistakes is not only reasonable, but you'd expect it from humans. The thing that's weird is that he continually does this over and over and over, and yet he is still held in the high regards of the people who find him a useful idiot, basically. Yes. So I genuinely would be shocked to hear people defend him in any meaningful way over the long term.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be really hard. That's why they have to adjust the timelines, because it looks funny if you don't.
Exactly.
All right. Our last take reads, at the core of every complaint about why things can't be beautiful, well-made, pleasant to use, safe, slow, relaxing, unhurried, well-compensated, efficient, is the simple fact that like 10 guys have 90% of the money on the planet. What do you think?
I think that I mean, this person is mixing a lot of concepts together, and that's the first thing, because initially I'm thinking, let's look at like beautiful and well-made, and beautiful, well-made, pleasant to use, or something like that. And the first thing that comes to my mind, because of bias, I was able recently to travel to Italy, and it was just looking at these massive buildings of beautiful architecture and just awe-inspiring cathedrals. And, I walk out and, talking with my wife, like, man, we do not inspire men to make great things like this anymore. And I wish we did. And of course we do in certain ways. And there are great things being made. They look different. And the times are different for sure. But if we're thinking about when a lot of the old architecture of things that were beautiful, well-made, and pleasant to use, a lot of these things historically happened when probably more than 90% of the money was owned by, in a smaller concentration, right? Like you look at the distributions of kingdoms and empires, and, you think that the average peasant had the relative share of wealth that the average person in the United States does as a citizen. Like, I'm not saying that our current system is perfect by any means. Like, there's definitely a conglomerate of people that are robbing the American people of their wealth. That is absolutely true. And it is also true that we are generating more wealth these days, so that the rich people of today are far richer than emperors, relatively speaking. But you also have to look, again, if we're talking about, the specifically beautiful, well-made, pleasant to use, it's not a matter of concentration of wealth. That's just simply not the case. But then But then, of course, he goes on to say safe, slow, relaxing, unhurried, well compensated, efficient. And you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We're mixing so many things here.
Yeah.
And so basically he's saying the only reason why we don't have utopia on Earth is because 10 guys have 90% of the wealth. And that is a wild claim, because you first have to say that this kind of thing is not only achievable, but that we have at one point had it when, distribution of the wealth was more equal. Because you would say that at any point at which this was not the case, which if you look at history, there's probably a period of time you could look at where wealth was, at least in some areas and aspects, more distributed, and life was beautiful, well-made, pleasant, safe to use, slow, relaxing, unhurried, well-compensated, efficient. And all of those things together, you have to justify. And it's rough to say that, because even when you want to look at what you might consider a modern paradise of sorts, there are always trade-offs. There are always other realities of where costs come in. And so this is just this. It's not, the reason why life can't be the core of every complaint about why things can't be this way. It's not because of the fact that 10 guys have 90% of the money on the planet, which is maybe an exaggeration, but it's most likely because that's how life works. Is that, in the words of Thomas Sowell, there are no solutions, there are trade-offs. And, when you create wealth, you still are trading off effort and usually some form of resource to create a different, more plentiful resource. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing and that you don't generate new stuff, but there is a trade-off there. And so in order for things to be efficient and slow and relaxing, it's like, I don't know, man, like you can't have your cake and eat it too in a world of finite resources, even if we are able to generate new wealth, which is a great thing that we can do with productivity and generally with free exchange.
Yeah, that's a really good point about like the medieval ages, and I assume you got to see like St. Peter's Basilica and everything. It's just absolutely. You look at it and you're like, oh my goodness, like I can't fathom what I'm looking at. Like I could spend hours just looking at it, not to mention, back in whenever they built it, figuring out how to build that, in the first place. And the reality of those types of things is that they took generations to build. Usually the people that designed and planned it weren't even alive sometimes in the end when it was finally built. And that is all about time preference. And I got this, for Christmas, I asked for Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard. And I listed the Mises Institute. Nice, you got it. I listed the Mises Institute on Gifster so people would buy it from there. And they were nice enough when they shipped it out, when I got the package and I opened it up, they also included 2 other books. I can't remember one of them, but the other one that I kind of started to read was How to Think About the Economy by Per Byland. It's just this tiny little book. It's awesome. And I just started reading it even before all the presents had been opened because it was so small. And in the very first few pages, he talks about trade-offs, like you were saying, that the economy can be understood by the fact that resources are limited, but our desires are unlimited. And people will make trade-offs of resources to more or less fulfill upwards or downwards those levels of desires. And they will also moderate their desires as well. But that's the trade-off, right? Like based on how many resources I have, I can only fulfill so many of these desires. So I'm going to have to allocate it in one way or the other. And so, like you're saying, this guy says a lot of things that are not true. Like you can't be efficient and also slow and relaxed. Like, I mean, you can in some ways, but like in general, those are like opposite things. Like efficient means as much stuff can be pumped out in the fastest amount of time. Slow and relaxed is like, I just kind of do it at the pace that I want to. But to give this guy the benefit of the doubt, and I think that what everyone from all sides of the aisles feel is that there is something wrong right now. In the past 100 years, things are not as beautiful. Things are not as well made. Even though we have a lot, and at least in the United States and other first world countries, like a lot of plenty and enough food and all this stuff, there's a feeling of a decrease in quality, a decrease in effort, a decrease in craftsmanship and workmanship. And you can kind of see this in like ancillary markets out in rural areas that have like, we have these handmade tables with a natural edge and things like that. And this guy is not wrong in his feeling about that, as well as his feeling that there is like a centralized single digit amount of people that are the problem and the cause of it. He definitely gets his prognosis wrong that it's 10 guys that have 90% of the money. That's not even correct. And if you want to talk about like who has the largest percentage of money in the world, like he should turn around and look at himself, because he probably lives in the United States or some other first world country. And you have the top 10 countries in the world have 75% of the wealth. So it's probably, that's not necessarily a good way to look at it. But like I was saying, he is correct that there is some central small group of people that are the cause of all this stuff. And like we were talking about with trade-offs, there's a trade-off of time preference that has been made. So when you've got something, and this is what sucks, is that it's so nerdy that it's not interesting to people, but it controls so much of their life. And it's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, by controlling interest rates, which when you control interest rates, you control people's time preference and the incentive behind time preference, whether they should or should not spend money. So when you have a really high interest rate, you're really incentivized to save money and not spend it. But if you have a low interest rate and the money supply is expanding, then you're incentivized to buy up and spend as much as you can, because your dollar today is not worth as much as your dollar is going to be tomorrow. And so when you have those calculus is being artificially implemented into the economy, people have to take it into account, and they govern their behavior behind that. So you ask yourself, why in the past 100 years has things been less quality? There's built-in obsolescence? It's because you literally have a financial system that makes it so that the dollar you earn from a product you sell today cannot buy that product or help you build that product 10 years from now. And so you have to be building in these types of mechanisms and these types of systems in the way that you build products, in the way that even the way that we, like decide about like marriage and art and all sorts of things are governed by this time preference, because it destroys our ability to plan for the future. Because it's you're not able to actually have a firm foundation, because there is no actual stability in the market. It's all at the whim of a few people at the Federal Reserve and in the government making things up or down. And then two, like, if the reality is not lock in step with what you would like it to be, or the way that you not what you'd like it to be, but in the way that like good, sound financial principles, that have long stood of like saving and spending in cash. Like, we haven't literally incentivized a debt economy. People taking on credit card debt and spending well beyond their means and living beyond their means. And it's like, yeah, if you incentivize that type of behavior, and we have over decades a culture of that type of behavior, yeah, you're going to have lots of people that are trading the long term and the things that are meaningful for what is expedient. And when you do that, everything sucks. Like, it's just, stuff is worse. Art is worse. Interpersonal relationships are worse. All of that stuff is worse. What sucks, again, is that the main driver of this, and yes, there's morals and there's a spiritual component. And I think if we could solve the spiritual component, maybe we would never have the Federal Reserve in the first place. But what so sucks is that it's such a nerdy concept. The second you say, oh, the Federal Reserve, like 90%, if we're going to use a number of people, just like their eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, okay, that sounds like some like nerdy accounting class thing. But it's like, it has so much power over your life. And so this guy's like instinct that there is some single person to blame for this is not completely wrong, because there really kind of is. It's you and me when we look internally at our own decisions and moral behavior. And it's also like some guy at the top, some banker at a private institution that has control over all of our lives by being able to artificially set the interest rate.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that strikes me, I mean, if you do talk about the sort of, I don't know, like not even spiritual. I mean, I think it is spiritual, but you don't even have to believe in the spiritual dynamics. Just on general human behavior, to say that you want, the core of all this comes down to the greed of this 10 people to 90%. But if you really think about it, wanting every single thing to be beautiful, well made, pleasant to use, safe, slow, relaxing, unhurried, well compensated, and efficient, that in and of itself is a form of greed. To think that you, in order to have something beautiful, ought to have no sacrifice whatsoever. Yeah. Now, again, I'm not saying that the ratio is balanced here. I'm not saying that we aren't in a situation where we're being ripped off in this ways, because I think you've illustrated, when you don't have these high time preference things, then everyone is sort of scrambling in a more destructive way. I think that's all correct. But also, I feel like almost the Disney generation of people growing up have been fed this lie that it's like, you can be whatever you want to be. Reality is what you make of it. We're almost back in a pre-World War I mindset of, we will make the reality that we want it to be, regardless of the facts, and ignoring the fact that, like, there, the real world, in order to see things of value being made, it costs something to do that. It doesn't, some of these terms in and of themselves are somewhat contradictory, right? To say that something is beautiful and well made, pleasant to use, and then also it's efficient, slow, and relaxing and unhurried, like, that's, those aren't, that, you could say that something is well made and slow. You can say that something is unhurried and pleasant to use, but you can't always say, slow and efficient and well made. Like, you have to choose where you're going to cut and sacrifice. And I think, again, when we as a culture don't have a good framework for what constitutes beauty or what constitutes value, then we are going to be unaware of this idea that you have to sacrifice for it. The value isn't something that just appears. Value in many ways is the concept of something that is desirable because it requires some level of sacrifice. There has to be something about it that is intrinsically unique, or there's a trade-off for it that makes it more desirous for you. That's not to say that anything of value necessitates you having to sacrifice, but something of value generally does have to have something sacrificed down the way. The reason why, for instance, getting a free ice cream cone is valuable, it might be free to you, but it's valuable because otherwise you would have to sacrifice to create the resources to make it yourself, or to make something of equal value to give to the person. It being free to you at that moment is valuable, but that doesn't mean that the person who made it didn't have to sacrifice for it. The reason it has value is because there was sacrifice that went into it. And so I think that there's this very detached from reality view that this post sort of encapsulates, that in order for things of beauty to be, there's no sacrifice necessary. In order for things that are well made to exist in our economy, there's no sacrifice on my part. These are just the things that ought to happen, and it's just the reality that ought to be. And it's a lot more complicated than that. So when you have the very real effects of a Federal Reserve that is incentivizing people to scrounge for everything now because there is no tomorrow, to burn the turf, as it were, then you end up with a very high disproportionate level of this sort of short time preference behavior that makes it so much skewed. But then people try to overcorrect and think, well, there ought to never be any cost to have all of these things and all of this reality, which is also not the case. So I don't know. I think that there needs to be a little bit more of a fundamental realignment of our culture's understanding of beauty, of value, of things that are well made, and recognizing that, again, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And that's not like a thing to bemoan or to take despair in, but to say, okay, how can I sacrifice in ways that better the future? How can I sacrifice in ways that create things that are going to last and be, I think that it's funny because I don't know about this individual poster, but a lot of people who share this sentiment are people maybe in our age group who aren't even willing to try to have children because they don't want to sacrifice their own well-being for something that's long-lasting and beautiful and good in the future, i.e. a child being raised into the next generation. That's probably the most beautiful, well-made thing you can do, and a lot of people aren't willing to sacrifice for that because it requires sacrifice. And it's like, no, let's realign and recognize sacrifice for the sake of something that is beautiful is a good thing. Even if it's overboard right now because of Federal Reserve and stuff, that doesn't mean sacrifice is inherently a bad or a wrong thing.
Exactly. And like you were saying with like kids and everything, like this is a spiritual problem. It's a problem of greed, and by greed also of, I don't know what the vice necessarily would line up with most likely, but probably greed. It like a lack of like desire for pain. Everything should be easy. There should be no pain. And we've done these types of takes before about parenthood, where people will literally say, and they'll justify their desire to not do hard things that are good by saying, well, so it's right for some people, but it's not right for me. And some people are built for it, or some people are, and it's like, I don't know, man. I think about that, and I think for parenthood and having a child, now that I have a child, and let me speak to the fact that it will if you want to be a good parent, you will be completely consumed by the fact that you have a child because they cannot do anything. They cannot live on their own. They require 24-hour supervision. So you and your spouse are going to be completely consumed by it. But the good side of it is that now you have clarity about what your purpose in life is. And that is just one of the best things that can ever happen to you, because you realize, like, oh man, like, life is more than what I would desire and what I care for. And it's so much better when I'm living it on behalf of another person and for a purpose that is bigger than myself. Going again, because I harped so much on the Federal Reserve, all that has done is just incentivized that type of behavior, right? In the same way that, like, lust and looking at bad things was a problem before the internet now made it possible to completely go overboard. Not even overboard, because it's always bad to look at bad stuff, but to have a pipeline to as many types of things and fall into our own decay as quickly as possible. And so all of these types of financial mechanisms are both a symptom and a perpetuation of our own terrible natures. And in order for us to get out of this rut, not only do we have to do away with the institution itself, I don't think that if tomorrow we pushed a button and we defunded the Federal Reserve and ended the Fed, that everything would get better. I think we would probably replace it with something as bad or worse. We'd have to simultaneously defund it as well as have a reckoning with our own spiritual hearts about the greed and the lack of desire to do hard but right and good things. Until we do that, we're always going to have this feeling that things are not as the way they ought to be, that they are not as good as they could be or as beautiful as they could be. And so it's both an individual and societal thing. And it, like Solzhenitsyn said, right, the crux of good and evil cuts through every single person's heart. And so we have to make that own decision every single day.
Yeah. Well said.
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. We will catch you on the next one.